This is $20. And I have a new book coming out, which actually is a new edition of a book that was called Probably More Than You Want to Know about the Fishes of the Pacific Coast. This new one is called Certainly More Than You Want to Know, with a subtitle, A Postmodern Experience, because I don't know what postmodern means, so I thought, what the hell. So, and that one's coming out in 2 months, and that one is actually going to be bigger than the Rockfish book, 672 pages, 490 species, 700 color photographs, and that's going to be $30. So if anyone is interested, there's a sign-up sheet here. You give me $30 now, and maybe I'll send you a book. Who knows? In mid-July, but I won't charge you for the shipping, and I'll pay for the sales tax and that. So that's $30 for that, and then $20 for the little black beauty down over there. So when I was 12 years old, my dad took me fishing on a party boat out of Malibu, and I remember that I was struck with the number of species of rockfish that we caught in about an hour and a half, 2 hours on one rock pond. There must have been, in retrospect, 15 or 20 species of rockfishes. And since that time, I've just been fascinated by it. So many species. They were of such economic, and are of such economic value, both sport value and commercial value. So when I was in graduate school at UCSB, I did my master's thesis and then PhD dissertation on life histories of rockfishes. And I got out in 1978, and I was eager to continue that because there were very few people working on rockfish at the time, all up and down the Pacific coast. There must have been a dozen of us working on them, even though they were of multi-million-dollar value to both industries. And in fact, I wrote 17 grant proposals to Sea Grant, which is a major federal granting institution, to work on rockfishes and some other species, and I was rejected for all of them. Because at the time, people didn't see the value of basic life history. How fast do they grow? What time do they reproduce? Stick a tag in them. Where do they go? Where do they migrate? Do they migrate? And so I could get no money at all to do the research on rockfishes. But I'm really stubborn, is what it comes down to. And I just decided to do the research myself, even though I couldn't get any money to do it. So I actually did most of my early research on life history of rockfish at Santa Barbara Seafood, which was owned by Mike Wagner, the guy who started Andrea's Seafood here. This is in Santa Barbara. And at the time, there was a very big commercial fishery for rockfish. Most of the rockfishes, not all of them, but most of them were filleted. So I asked Mike, this is about 1978, can I just dissect these fish, take their ear bones out so we can age them, take their gonads out so I can figure out when they reproduce, before you fillet them, before your people fillet them? And he said, fine. So like 6:30 in the morning, I go down there, and on several occasions, I actually got into a tug of war between myself and a filleter. I really need that fish. And I didn't speak Spanish. I didn't say, please give me the fish. So I just knew corazon, because that's always I was hearing on the radio that they were from. So screaming corazon, corazon, which means heart, it just doesn't do it. So I actually had my daughter, who was like 6 at the time. She would come on days when she didn't have kindergarten. She would come and drag fish across the. When she got to be about 7, she said, no more of that stuff. But so until around 95, I just could not get any funding to do rockfish research. And then I'm sitting in my office, and I'm on soft money, which means my salary and those of everybody in my lab comes from grants. I don't get money from the university. The university gives me an office, and that's it. I have to bring in my own money, my own salary through the university. And I had no money at the time. It was so bad that the business director, officer of the biology department had come into my office and had measured my office and walked out without saying anything. That's So I'm sitting there in some kind of stupor, and a guy calls and he said, this is Lyman Thorson's son. I'm with the National Biological Survey. I understand you're interested in rockfish. And I said, yeah. I never heard of him. And NBS had just started. Clinton had just set it up. And he said, well, we're a new agency. I have some money for rockfish research. What would you do with the money? And I'm going like, who is this? like, because a typical researcher, it's like a scene out of a Dickensian novel. You have to go, please, could I have some gruel salad? They don't come to you and say, would you like some gruel, man? Nobody calls you with money, so I said, well, okay, I'm really interested in rockfish life histories, certainly their movements. I'm really interested in the oil platforms out here because even though no one's done any work, I suspect they may be habitat for rockfish. He went, oh, that sounds good. And I said, okay. I said, do you actually have money? He said, yes. I said, okay, well, I'd like to take a little submarine, and I'd like to go and count fishes around oil platforms and natural reefs. He said, that sounds interesting. That sounds pretty expensive. I said, how much money have you got? He said, I can't tell you. I said, well, it probably costs $6,000 a day. He said, that's not too much. And I thought, oh, this dude's got a lot of money. So that's what started the paid part of the research, and indeed, I've had money ever since to essentially look at the role that oil platforms play as fish habitat. We're not going to talk a lot about that tonight. I want to talk to you about it, but Dave Kushner, National Park Service, said you guys couldn't handle it or something. I don't know. Implied I should talk about rockfish, which are the dominant fishes around oil platforms anyway, so it's probably great. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. We're going to go through a little bit about rockfish biology and ecology and systematics and so forth. If you have questions as we go, let me know. I probably won't belittle you. Well, I might, but I'm sure you can handle it. Of course, you couldn't handle me talking about oil platforms. Well, I'm not sure.
Milton, the oil platforms aren't in the park.
They're not in the park. Oh, I see. So if they don't live in the park, we can't talk about them. Oh, they move back and forth. I see. That was cleverly done. So, okay. So, this is, some of you have seen this before, this is the Love Lab, my lab, with the motto of our lab, we get paid to think, so you don't have to. Because I'm on soft money and we try to get money from the federal government however we can. During the Bush administration, we changed our motto. It's better if you just think of me as a hooker. And it'll all fall into place. And then Obama was elected president, so we had to change it to, yes, we can get more federal funding. So that's worked out okay. So this is a map that shows where the rockfishes live. The rockfishes all live in the same, or all are in the same genus, Sebastes, which means magnificent in Greek. One of the few marine groups of fishes where you have many, many, many species, all in the same genus, all very closely related. Some rockfishes probably, some pairs of rockfish species probably separated 20,000, 30,000 years ago. There are some that are actually in the process. You can see that they're just barely separated today. And if you came back in 50,000 years, they'd be clearly distinct species, but they're just kind of right on the cusp right now. Most of the species live on the Pacific coast of the United States and Mexico. There's probably around 75 species approximately on our coast, and about 30 species on kind of the Korean-Japanese side of things. There's 2 or 3 down here in South America, and about 4 Atlantic. The first species that was named Sebastes was Sebastes marinus, and the person who named it was Cuvier. Cuvier was one of the great French biologists of all time. He was an anatomist. He described many, many species of not just fish, but of animals in general. And the neat thing about Cuvier, and he was most productive from about 1780 to about 1830, was that he was a big-time scientist and bureaucrat, not just a scientist, during the last Louis, during the Reign of Terror, during Napoleon, and then when the next Louis came back. And the fact that he kept his head throughout that whole thing, not just as some like flaming peasant there, but as a kind of a Heimacher, as my mother would say, that's quite amazing. The dude was not just talented, but quite adept politically. So he was the first person who named the rockfish. The next person who named any species of rockfish, described any species, was a guy named John Richardson, Sir John Richardson, who described the copper rockfish, which lives off here, Sebastes corinus. He named one after that was caught in Monterey. Richardson was not only a good biologist, but he was the physician on several of the Arctic expeditions during kind of the Franklin period. In fact, when Franklin disappeared in the Arctic, he was on one of the expeditions that went to try to find the dude. And Richardson is most well known as an explorer when they were stranded in what is now kind of the Yukon Territory. And there were only about 3 of the original British team left, or in his group. And they caught their Inuit scout. I don't know, he probably wasn't Inuit now that I'm thinking about it. A local who was a scout who had shot one of the British guys and eaten him. And Richardson just shot him, just like that. And I'm going like, most ichthyologists, they just don't have to do that. You know, but, I mean, I would if I had to, but I haven't had to. So that's Richardson. And then there was a gap until the gold rush period. And then people started describing the rockfish on the Pacific coast. The first guy who actually described many of them was a guy named Joseph Ayres, who was a doctor in gold rush San Francisco. And every time I think about this, I'm going like, oh, a doctor. But you know what? In 1852, doctors didn't know squat, man. You know, you came in with consumption, with tuberculosis, and they put a leech in your navel or something like that. I mean, they didn't know anything, right? So, but they had a lot of spare time, and it turned out, if you look at how long does it take to put a leech in somebody's navel? Right? So, if you look at California, the early scientists, most of them were physicians or the like, and he was at the California Academy of Sciences, one of the founding members. And he would go down to the there were wharfs, but the fish markets at the time were people coming in, mainly Italians and Sicilians, coming in around 1852, beaching their boats and selling their fish on the strand there. And he would just go around and go like, well, no one's ever described that one, and he'd take it back to where we took it back, and he would describe the animal and publish it in a scientific journal most of the time. And occasionally, to give you an idea of his life, he would actually publish a description of a new fish in the newspaper, right? So that these 4, like the Alta California, 4-page newspapers, and there's a description of, Sebastes, whatever, Mistens, or something like that. So it's kind of rough and ready system. If you look at the number of species along the coast, there's a huge difference. And it turns out that most of the species, the greatest number of species, is in Southern California. And then tends to decrease to the north and to the south, though to the south, we don't know how fast they decrease because the amount of scientific inquiry along the Baja California coast is kind of minimal. So we don't really know. But it certainly does decrease as you go south. So there's probably someplace around 60, 62 species of rockfish in Southern California, most of which occur at some level in the Santa Barbara Channel, or at least if you include the backsides of the islands in our general vicinity. Once you get north, they tend to decrease, and they decrease very rapidly along the Aleutians. And this phenomena here, where you see Kodiak Island having a fair number, and then they just kind of go to hell, turns out for a lot of groups of fishes, the sculpins, some of the greenling-like fishes, there'll be a fair number of them to the east, and then get around Kodiak and the numbers of species just plummets. So there's some kind of oceanographic phenomenon that occurs in that area. Rockfish live in a wide number of habitats. There are some species that are kind of generalists. You can find them over high relief or low relief. A good example are green striped rockfish. I don't think I have a picture of one, but trust me, there's a couple that you can find them on high relief, boulders and low relief cobble, and even on mud. But they tend to be fairly specific to the kind of habitat that they live in, which means that if you take a feature, here's Anacapa, here's Santa Cruz, we're over here. There's a feature called the footprint, which is right here, which is actually a subsea mountain range. And if you look, it's called a footprint because if you look on navigation charts, the top of it, the piece that's in about 360 feet of water, is shaped kind of in an oval. And first mariners called it the footprint. But if you actually look at what it is, it's this big mountain range that runs from about 360 feet at the top. Then there's a lot of stuff in 400, 500, 600 feet. And then by the time you get down to about 900 feet, you're down into this kind of muddy area. Well, we've done a lot of research using our, it's not my little submarine, but the little submarine that we chartered. When we do our surveys of fishes, I tend to do surveys around oil platforms and then around natural reefs, so we have a frame of reference for comparison. And every year I try to go out to the footprint to see how populations of fishes are changing, or if they are. And you can clearly see that different species of rockfish inhabit different depths and different habitats. And I think I have an example here. So if you compare square spot rockfish, and we'll talk a little more about those later, with cowcods. I have a tattoo of a cowcod. That is my favorite fish. You can see differences. So basically, all of these, ignore the white lines. Those are depth contours. So what we're looking at are the colored lines, and each one of those colored lines is a track of the submarine. Okay? And the closer to red the track is, the more of whatever I'm showing you we saw. So if you look at, and these are not quite to scale, so don't be confused. This area here is the same as this little area up here. So you actually have to kind of get used to that. So square spots, really, really common up on the top of the feature. And that's because they like water that's 140, 180, 200, 300, 400 feet. And big high relief. And like kind of low, kind of fist-sized cobbles, they like that too. And the top of the feature has a lot of that kind of habitat. On the other hand, cowcods, not so much. Adult cowcods, not so much. Where you do tend to find them is as you start to get deeper and the habitat gets really radical in that area. It's these huge cliff faces, caves where you could run the submarine, into them, and there's still room around you. Very different habitat. So you find on any given feature, you'll find, yes, you'll find 18 or 20 or 25 species of rockfish, but they partition out the habitats. And indeed, on most of our deeper reefs, rockfishes are dominant by either biomass, pounds of them, or numbers of species, or numbers of individuals. There are lots of other species of fishes, but the rockfishes really characterize much of the habitat. Once you get deeper than about 150 feet, you go into the kelp beds, there's basses, there's sculpins, there's all kinds of things, and rockfishes. You start getting deeper, almost everything else kind of fades away, and you have this swath of rockfish. So when did they evolve? Probably at least the Miocene. Miocene started about 5.3 million years ago and goes back to 20 million years or more. This is a fossil one from the diatomite beds. Diatomite are fossil diatoms. And we have huge deposits of them around Lompoc, and where there's all kinds of fossils, not just rockfishes, but herrings, all kinds of things. And that particular formation is about, is that my stomach? So the diatomite formation there is in the 10 to 12 million year range, and you find fossils of rockfishes. What's interesting about fossils, though, is that these could have passed for modern ones. If you look at the bone structure and so forth, these are not primitive ancestral rockfishes. What that means is that rockfishes probably go much further back, maybe even to the Eocene, back around 30 million years. But for a rockfish to become fossilized, it has to wind up, it can't wind up, if you're living in a rock and you die, well, it's really hard to be fossilized. So conditions have to just be right. And a lot of Eocene material, first of all, we don't have a lot of that in California. And the chances of a very primitive rockfish actually getting fossilized in Eocene material, apparently, it's not very large because we haven't seen it. So at least 10 million, 12 million years ago, and probably a bit older. So rockfishes are still evolving, as are many things, but rockfish is just like do it like little bats out of hell. So you get species, good species, that is, either they don't reproduce at all with each other, or if the two species reproduce, the offspring are not as viable, as competitive as the parents, that are very closely related. For instance, this is the gopher rockfish. This is the black and yellow rockfish. For a long time, there was a real question as to whether these were good species. But if you look at, actually it's nuclear DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, actually you cannot tell. I think it's nuclear DNA. You can find that there are slight consistent differences between these two. No one has yet seen hybrids between these two species, so they tend to be good. But the only real difference that we can see is that these tend to be brown or black and yellow, and these tend to be brown and kind of pinky or fleshy colored. And that's basically it. Black and yellows tend to be found in 10 to 40 feet of water, gophers in 30 to 100 feet of water, so there's an overlapping but slight difference in depth, but pretty similar organisms and organizations. Even today, people are discovering new species of rockfish. What is that? Anybody know what species? It's the blue rockfish. Well, it was thought to be the blue rockfish. Blue rockfish are hyper abundant in some places on the Channel Islands. You out to San Miguel in particular, Santa Rosa, tens of thousands of them. These big schools, very nice looking, sleek fish, very typical of these schooling midwater rockfishes. And up until about 2 years ago, everybody thought, well, there's the blue rockfish, Sebastius miscus. But it turns out that there's two species. And they look very similar. And the commercial government had been telling scientists for years, there are these two kinds. And you go to the Farallones, and we get this kind, we get that kind. And finally, Don Pearson of the National Marine Fisheries Service said, okay, bring in the two batches, put them in separate sacks. And I just happened to be there in Santa Cruz the day he brought them out, and he put sack one on one bench and sack two on the other table. And you start looking at them and you go like, well, maybe they are different. And when you look at the genetics, they are different. So this one is currently called the blue-sided. And this one is the blue-blotched. See, it's like blotchy colored in here, and the other one was consistently blue. And it turns out that that stands up. The other one has a lateral line that's kind of raised and a slightly larger mouth. It all seems to be consistent. This is, by the way, is stylaster, which is, isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
It's a hydrocoral, and it starts, you can find a little bit of it at the backside of Gull Island in about 20 feet of water, little colonies. But it really doesn't kick in until you get into 80 or 90 feet. And then by about 180 feet, it peters out. Very narrow range. Stylasters all over the world are found in different species, are found in the same kind of habitats. They tend to be found on seamounts, rocky pinnacles, with high current. And this is true of every species of stylaster anyone's ever found on Earth, including ours. The ones in Southern California are almost completely always purple, though I think Dave collected some that are kind of pinky, orangey, up at San Miguel. Some there. And then when you get to Central California, this color predominates, this kind of orangey and pinky stuff, and then the purple starts to drop out for reasons that are obscure. So anyway, you have two species of blue rockfish that just in the last couple of years people have gone, okay. Here's another example. Up until a couple of years ago, you look at this fish, and first of all, most fishermen would call it a red snapper. But the official name was vermilion rockfish. Well, it turns out there's two species of vermilion rockfish. This is actually thought to be a new one called Crocotulus, which means sunset in Latin. And so this is the sunset rockfish. And that one tends to be found in slightly deeper water than this one, which is the other vermilion rockfish, Sebastius miniatus. But up until the time of genetics, when people started actually poking around the DNA, no one had figured that out. This, by the way, as several other images, was taken by a remarkable photographer, Kuika Chetrans, who died 3 years ago, who took unbelievably beautiful photographs. He was a software engineer, I think, at Cisco. And he was a typical kind of ballsy diver, and the ballsiness caught up with him. He dove by himself in Northern California, and his boat was found, but he never was. So no one knows what actually happened to him. He took a lot of chances, but he took fabulous photographs. Rockfishes have internal fertilization. Not only that, but they are viviparous. That is, there is some sort of transfer of nutrients from the female to the embryos in the uterus. They don't have placentas. No rockfish has a belly button. But what happens is that the females produce a nutrient from the uterine wall, and the embryos eat it. Okay, so they are being fed. So no one, well, I'm not sure this is true. Virtually no one has ever seen mating of rockfish on the Pacific coast. And there's an awful lot of people underwater, people who are looking for this kind of stuff, who would know what they were seeing. And I think people have seen it once or twice. In Japan, where this photograph was taken, this is the female right here, and that's the male over there. In talking to our Japanese colleagues, I was at a meeting in Hawaii once, an East-West meeting, and people in the Japanese were going like, well, what's the problem? And we're going like, well, no, we've never seen it. And they go, well, here's a photograph. I mean, it's like pulling out your wallet. Here's some video. And we don't know why. I mean, we don't know. There are differences between rockfishes on both sides. For instance, the eggs of the rockfishes off Japan and Korea tend to be smaller. The species that live there tend to have smaller diameter eggs than the ones on our coast. Who knows why? But they do have internal fertilization. What that means is that people who want to set up, for instance, hatcheries for rockfishes have a big hurdle to overcome. I remember that there was a commercial fisherman who specialized in rockfishes. I think he's still hook and lining them. And about 15 years ago, he wrote a letter to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, the people who control the quotas for rockfishes. And he said two things. He said, number one, cowcods, which had just been declared overfished, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. He said there's plenty of cowcods. He can't imagine why anybody would think they're overfished. And he also said, and we can set up hatcheries for them, right? So here's what, so I want to kind of address both of those. So he said, I can go out to Cortez Bank. Cortez Bank is about 100 miles out. And I remember talking with him about it, and he wrote this in the letter. He said, I can go and fill my boat up with cowcods. He said, they're not, uncommon or overfished. And I said, so when you go out there, you just randomly drift around and you can fill the boat up. And he said, no, I got a couple spots. And I'm going like, and I actually did this, so I tossed my wallet out. I said, so if all of this is Cortez Bank, and there's one of your spots, and you drift over it, what happens? He said, fill the boat up with cowcod. And I go like, what happens when you drift off the spot? He said, I don't catch any cowcod. And I said, because what he had done was, he had said, I got some spots, and each one is an acre, so there's, my spot's 10 acres, and he estimated how many cowcod there were, and then he multiplied that out by the entire lake. And he came up with like 2 billion cowcod. And I said, but you're not actually counting fish all over the bank, just on your little spots there, right? So that was a little problem. And then the other problem was, he said, why don't you just do like they do for salmon and set up a cowcod hatchery? You got males, you got females, you take, in essence, a petri dish, you put the cowcod eggs in the petri dish, and then you put cowcod sperm in the petri dish, and then you can grow up the little cowcod, which is what they do for salmon. Well, salmon are not viviparous. They don't have to have internal fertilization. The female sticks the eggs in the gravel, covers them over, and the eggs do their thing all by themselves. They don't need any nutrition from the female. What he's essentially saying is, you want to have more deer? Here's what you do. You take deer eggs, and you put them in a petri dish. And then you take deer sperm, Okay? You fertilize the egg and then you throw them in the bushes. And then you'll get more deer. Right? You know? It doesn't happen that way. And that's the reason that people who talk about hatcheries as a way of solving problems for rockfish anyway, that's a hard proposition because you got to get, you know, you have to bring in females that are already pregnant, or you have to get them to mate. And it's done. And the National Marine Fisheries Service has a has a lab up in Washington, and they've done it. And USGS has a lab out by Port Townsend, and they've done it. But if you're lucky, if you take 100,000 larvae and you get 50 that grow up to be 3 inches long. So it's probably not the way we're going to get ourselves out of the overfishing dilemma that we found ourselves. There's the larvae. Larvae turn out to be not very competent when they come out of the female. They drift around in the plankton, probably are unable to swim against currents for a considerable period of time. Larvae stay in the plankton a minimum of a month before, in a few cases, settling out to a kelp bed or whatever. But more often they turn into what are called pelagic juveniles, which is a more recognizable fish shape. And they'll stay like that for a month or 2 or 3, or in the case of Boccaccio, 6 maybe. And by that time they're actually able to kind of swim a bit. And the thinking there is that they may actually, at that point, when they're about ready to settle out on a rock or settle out on the sand, they're able to cue in on some sort of environmental cue. It could be noise. Reefs are really noisy. You've got snapping shrimp that are snapping, and you know, all kinds of things going on. Or smell. There are all sorts of organisms that are laying out chemical trails. Maybe they hone in on those. But at some point, it's thought that they are no longer passive. They're actually swimming. And in fact, there's fairly good evidence that by the time, you're a week or 2 or away from being ready to settle out, they're forming schools in the midwater, maybe 50 feet down, maybe 100 feet down, maybe a couple miles offshore. But they are slowly getting back to where they want. If they don't get back to where they want, then they die. And in fact, what you see is you see years where clearly virtually every larvae of a species die, because you get no recruits of little ones, or very few. On other years, clearly a lot of the ones survive because you get astronomical numbers of these little ones that survive. That's true of most species of fish. That's not unusual, but it's very obvious among the rockfishes. 1999, for instance, was a year where there was a lot of upwelling, a lot of cold nutrient water that occurred apparently just at the right time, and many, many species of rockfishes showed very good survivorship of these larvae and pelagic juveniles. I mean, we could see them around the platforms. All of a sudden, come May or June, there's all these boccaccios, and there's all these blue rockfish, and all these olive rockfish, whereas in the previous year there was essentially none. Last year was a pretty good year for a lot of species of rockfish. Hundreds of thousands of boccaccio, for instance, around platform Gilbert and platform Grace. But it's very patchy. We did a study where we had divers go out every single week from June to September. That's when these little rockfish will recruit normally to structure. We had them go out to Gale, platform Gale, and to platform Grace. Those are only 5 miles apart. Okay? And you could clearly see that for some reason, lots of fish recruited to platform Grace, and not so many from Gale. They're really close together. So there was some difference in oceanographic conditions that led to that. So it's very patchy and very unpredictable about what will recruit, how much will recruit. What we know is that fishes like boccaccios and rockfishes in general, they don't have good survivorship years very often. Maybe once a decade for a fish like a boccaccio. There are some rockfishes, and we can talk about this, we will talk about this in a little while, that live over 100 years. There are very few rockfish that actually live less than 15 or 20. And one one rough-eye rockfish that was caught off Catch was aged at 205 years last. So some of those individuals, some of the species live a very, very long time. What that means is, in terms of evolutionary selection, is that these fish do not reproduce successfully very often. So, but it doesn't matter, because maybe you're 20 years old when you mature, and you live on average to 160. That's 140 years of trying to reproduce every single year. And all you have to do if you're a female is to reproduce yourself and a mate once, that is successfully to the adult stage. And if you have 120 years to do it, you know, apparently that. So this was from the Rockfish book. I wanted to show people that one of the problems in rockfish biology is that the larvae all look the same. You can actually tell out of the, say, 70 species off the California coast, you can tell about 8 of them apart by their larvae. And the problem with that is one of the ways people assess populations of fish, like sardines, is they go out, they tow nets in the water, and they figure out what are the densities of eggs, or what are the densities of sardine larvae in a bunch of places all along the coast, and from that you can actually extrapolate how many adults did it take to produce those. Well, that's great, and that's the way they do stock assessments. That's how you figure out the biomass of sardines or anchovies. But you can't do that with most species of rockfish. You tow a net, you get the larvae, but you don't know what they are. You can actually do a genetic screening on them, but it's really expensive, it's really slow. People keep talking about it, but no one's doing it. So that's one of the reasons it's so hard to figure out, well, how many boccaccio are there out there? Or how many cowcod are there? Are the populations going up? Are they going down? You can't use one of the tools that fisheries biologists normally use. So when rockfishes get a bit older, as I say, they go from a larval stage to a pelagic juvenile stage, or to a juvenile stage. And those can be in various places. There are a group of rockfishes, for instance, that really, really like drifting kelpmans. And it's the only place you'll find them, generally. For instance, little treefish. These are little treefish. They're most abundant around drifting kelpmans. If you go out to one of the NOAA weather buoys out there, they like that kind of stuff. They are okay around oil platforms, but they're not, as abundant. But you can't find them normally in a kelp pit, in an anchored kelp pit. There's something about being offshore, maybe in drifting material, that they've adapted. This fish here under a drifting kelpman, that's a split-nosed rockfish. They spend their whole lives as adults living on mud and low-lying rock, but when they're young, they really, really like this drifting material. So that's kind of one life history strategy that some have pursued. When they hit the bottom, they're still hard to tell apart. This is a vermilion rockfish. This is a little vermilion, maybe it's maybe 3 months old. Give you an idea of the size. This is a brittle star, so that fish is about 2 inches long. When it gets, and in pretty shallow water, this is like 40 or 50 feet of water. That's a typical depth, and this is the typical habitat where a vermilion will live briefly, and that's very, very common. A lot of rockfishes, they settle out from the plankton in relatively shallow water, and as they get older, they get deeper and deeper until they find the adult depth that they prefer. In the case of either a vermilion or a sunset rockfish, in 2 or 3 months after this, they will no longer be black. They'll start getting that kind of scarlet coloration. And within about a year, they've now migrated out into, instead of 45 or 50 feet of water, they're out there in 100 or 120, 150 feet of water. And by the time they're adults, maybe 6 or 8 years of age, they're out there in 250, 300, 400 feet of water. So there's this slow movement. Not all species. There are some species that are typical kelp bed ones. But some of these deeper ones recruit shallow and then go deep. Of course, not all species do that because you're dealing with rockfishes. Another problem for us, I mean, a lot of what I do and what people in my lab do and my associates do, we go underwater and we identify rockfish and we count them and so forth. But it's really hard to identify rockfish underwater. I'm actually working on another book that is going to be a photographic guide to rockfishes underwater. There's going to be no dead fish shots. It's all underwater. But here's the problem. So this is the chili pepper rockfish. This is kind of the way they look when you catch them. You bring them up, and they're kind of pink, tan, without really distinct barring or anything like that. Well, this is often how you see them underwater. But if they get frightened, they turn into that down below. This is the same fish. See this kind of sponge that's sitting there? This is about 10 seconds apart. Look how different, first of all, look how different these are, but look how different they are from the kind of above the surface kind of look. And that's very typical for a number of species. There are species that will live, kind of hover in mid-water, maybe 10, 15, 20 feet above the substrate, and they get this kind of lack of pattern quality to their skin. As soon, and I've actually seen this happen, as soon as they get down the bottom, within 15 or 20 seconds, they change and they get bars on them or stripes on them. And maybe look like this, but the peculiar thing, and I saw this at a little rocky area on the other side of Anacapa that's in 1,100 feet of water, okay? So you go down, and the sub has all these lights, so you can actually see what's going on. You turn the lights out, and it's dark, okay? Unless something is bioluminescent, and there are things, but not a lot, it's dark. So we had the lights on, and this chili pepper comes by. It's probably, like a foot and a half long. And it comes by the port, and it looks like this. And then it settles down the bottom, and it changes to that typical benthic bottom look, right? I'm going like, oh, yeah, okay. But then I start thinking like, well, why did they do that? Because it's like black down there. Nothing can see them. And they certainly can't see a difference in pattern. And yet they still do it. Even though it serves apparently no selective, well, it must serve some selective advantage, but I don't know what that advantage is. But you see it all the time in a number of species. Here's another example, the chameleon rockfish. These are the same two fish that are of economic importance. They were of huge economic importance earlier on, before there was kind of vast overfishing that went on. These shots were taken by Julius Phillips, who was a fish and game biologist, who was most active from the 20s to the 50s for California Fish and Game, and was the first person to write a monograph on the rockfish. I mean, it's like the little Bible that we all go to. He was very conservative as far as figuring out what different species were what. He actually, at the end of it, he said, oh, and then I found these hybrids that didn't seem to belong to any species, and they all turned out, he has about 4 of them, they all turned out to actually be new species. But he just couldn't take the leap and go, well, maybe they're just undescribed species. So, but he was a very, very good biologist. He was also a very good photographer, and this was a picture of hook and line rock cod fishing off Point Sur in the late 20s. This is a very typical way that rockfishers were first caught. They're almost all caught first by hook and line. People would lay out baskets and baskets and baskets of line, and every 2 or 3 feet would be a leader with a hook on it, and you use salted mackerel or salted anchovies or squid or something, and then you just lay them out. And there were so many fish at the time that you really could fill up your boat with fish relatively quickly. See there, and you could get almost no money for them because they were really common. They were popular and they sold well, but I'm wagering that in 1920 this dude got like a penny a pound, which was okay. I mean, people made a living, and in fact, there's a quote from a guy who specialized in fishing for rockfish off Monterey. He said, "You're never going to starve." Because there was always a market. Even in the Depression, there was always a market. I was a commercial fisherman for a short time in college in Santa Barbara. I fished for rockfish. And this was like 1968, right? And I would get, my partner and I, John Lucci and I, would get 6 cents a pound for boccaccios and for chilies, things where the skin was a pink color or a brown color, fishes with red or orange on them, which were all called reds. Together, we would get 12 cents a pound. We would get twice as much. And the reason for that, and that's still true, by the way, that brightly colored fish, you get more for than the drabber ones. And the reason for that was that, particularly in the Asian markets, the Asians really like brightly colored, particularly red fishes. And so a vermilion rockfish was never filleted. It was always sold whole, and the processor could get more money, and I could get more money for it. A boccaccio was always filleted, and they didn't care what it was if they were going to fillet it. It was actually called junk. Junk you got 6 cents a pound for. Reds, which were about 8 or 10 species, you could get 12 cents a pound for. And that carried through, and you can look at the records from 1918. And it's the same phenomenon, that brightly colored rockfish, you got a lot more for than the other one. So hook and line was actually the major way of catching rockfish for decades, a century, basically. And the reason was, at the time, it was very hard to drag a net over high rock piles. So the typical way of catching sole, typical way of catching sablefish and things like that was an otter trawl. You drug them along the bottom. But you really, even with what was called a semi-balloon trawl, which kind of rode up off the bottom, you couldn't drag over rocks that were much higher than this podium, than this platform. Until the Vietnamese came, the Vietnamese boat people came in the early 70s, people who were escaping the Vietnam War and who had been commercial fishermen in Vietnam and who used monofilament gill nets. Monofilament gill nets are great. If you want to catch fish, holy moly, they are spectacular because for various reasons. First of all, they're invisible underwater. The gill nets before that time had been made out of nylon and were actually pretty visible. So you caught fish, but you didn't catch very many. Also, nylon was expensive. Monofilament was cheap. You could lay a gill net right over a rock pile at San Miguel Island. If you lost it, who cares? It just didn't matter. There was a lot more monofilament gill net available. And so the Vietnamese very quickly went like, golly, nobody's fishing like this. And the rockfish fishery just skyrocketed, escalated. And so you saw kind of a continuation kind of rockfish dinking along until about 1975, 1970, let's say. And then it essentially went up asymptotically as both Vietnamese and the local native gill netters all of a sudden discovered kind of an untapped reservoir of fish. And as you would expect, what would happen then is you start depleting the nearest reefs. And then you go further and further and further out until you essentially run out of shallow reefs. And then you start going deeper, 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 until about 1995, you ran out of places to go. And at that point, it was really clear that there was some severe damage being done. The exception to the dragging no trawl rule is this. This is a species called Pacific Ocean perch, POPs, which are rockfishes, and which are found predominantly from the Bering Sea down to about northern California, but really from about Washington to the Bering Sea. That's where these huge populations were found. And the people who fished them first were the Russians. Russians first fished them, Japanese first fished them in the 50s, and really nailed the populations. And at that time, foreign fishers could fish up to 3 miles away from the coast. That was pretty close to shore, and they did that in the Gulf of Alaska. In the 70s, the Magnuson-Stevens Act was passed, and all of a sudden they couldn't fish that close to shore. They had to stay way offshore, and the idea was it would allow American fishermen to come in and harvest the resource. And they did. They actually came and picked up the cripples, in essence, and drove the POP fishery population from low to really low. And so that was the first overfished, I think that was the first officially overfished species on the Pacific coast of anything, was POPs, which were declared overfished, I can't remember, in the 70s. Recreational fishing, there was a lot of recreational fishing for rockfish. This is called a pleasure trip to the Farallones. So this is the Farallon Islands. This is from, I think, 1854. It's not the Alta California. Every single person is throwing up, including the dog. So basically people went out there to fish for rockfish. There are no fish in this whole thing, I've looked, but that's what they were fishing for. So clearly there was recreational angling going on in the mid-1850s for rockfish. And it was actually at a low level for a long time, because if you think about it, up through the teens, the 19-teens, most fishing done by the average middle-class person was from piers. There were no party fishing boats until the early 20s. So rockfish just were not a big part of the recreational take. Rich people who went out to Catalina, Charles Holder, who started the Tuna Club, those folks, they almost never fished for rockfish because they were catching yellowtail. They were catching white sea bass. They didn't want to catch a bunch of fish that, felt like a lead weight when you brought them up. Come about 1922-23, so people in Southern California kind of discovered party boats. And the fact that you could take out 30, 40, 50 people at a time, and you didn't have to charge them much because you could pack a lot of people on the boat. And all of a sudden, people were fishing for rockfish more and more. This is, that actually looks like Tugboat Andy. God, that's not Marie Dressler. But anyway, this is from the 30s, and this is Catalina. And these are, virtually all of these are vermilion rockfish. I mean, again, we've all looked at every single fish. I think most of them are. That could be a chili right there. But it's symbolic of kind of the rise of rockfish in the recreational fishery. But it was still kind of a gradual rise because until you had pretty sophisticated techniques for finding rocks in 600 feet of water, it was kind of a random process. I remember when I was a kid, I started fishing on party boats in Santa Monica, and they have fathometers, little strip charts, but they had no radar, they had no Loran, and I've now actually dove with the sub on the spots that I fished when I was 12 years old, and they're like 10 miles off the coast, and I remember Orrin Winfield, who was this lovely skipper that I used to go out with, who spent all of his time smoking and coughing. And who was about 65 at the time, and went to the same high school I did, but 60 years before, Santa Monica High School. He found his spots mainly either by landmarks, which I have done when I was a commercial fisherman. Basically, you line up the spire of that building with the blaze on that hill, with the rock there, with the thing. And actually, it's very good if you can see the coast. But if you're 10 miles out and it's foggy, what do you do? So it was kind of an art form. Not any clod with a speedboat could go out and fish for rockfish because you needed electronics, and electronics were very primitive. Unfortunately, what happened by the 80s is people had little Loran units and eventually GPS units, and now any clod with a handheld GPS can go back to the same reef every single day if it's foggy, if it's clear, and you can nail the fishes down to the point where, the biggest fish is 6 inches long. Whereas before, in the 30s and 40s, there was kind of a protection against that because only a few people could find these spots. Nevertheless, this is a scene, a party boat scene from the 60s when I started fishing for rockfish. This is actually taken at a place called Hidden Reef, which is out by Santa Barbara Island. And was famous for the cowcods and the really large rockfish. And one of the reasons was it was deep. It was like 800 or 900 feet. It gets shallower, but they fished in 800 or 900 feet. There wasn't a lot of fishing pressure there, so there was a lot of big fish. I remember going out of Paradise Cove sport fishing on this boat, a gentleman. And there was like astronomical numbers of big fish. I go to the same places now. There's not very many big fish left. The average, I actually did a study, I guess I don't have a slide, where I looked at how many fish on a typical survey, which takes up about a quarter of a mile. How many fish did we see that were bigger than 1.5 feet long at various places? And on most of the natural reefs in Southern California, there are very few fish bigger than 1.5 feet long. There's lots and lots of little fish, either young ones or species that don't get big. But around 18 inches, they can bite a hook, they can get entangled in a gill net, somehow they're going to get caught. They kind of get pruned at that point. Even if you go 120 miles off the coast before you fall off the continental shelf, those spots have very, very few big fish. And people like to blame commercial fishermen for all these evils, but in Southern California, sport fishermen probably have an equal role in it, or even greater. There are millions of recreational anglers in Southern California, and they just take an awful lot of fish, historically. There I am, doing my best to wipe out the Boccaccio population. This is the reason, that's a copper rockfish. I did very little when I was a kid except fish and unsuccessfully chase girls. Obviously, we don't. Very clear in retrospect. There's my tattoo. Outside tattoo. This is, my first wife called me the most self-involved person she ever met. That's true. So I mentioned that rockfish live a long time, and the question arises, and this is a very important part of any assessment of a fish's population, is how long do the fish live? How many fish of every year class is there out there? You don't want a population of fish that has only juveniles. You want older fish. Turns out, for instance, this is called the big old fat female hypothesis. Turns out that in many species of rockfish, older females produce healthier larvae. Larvae that are more likely to survive drifting around at sea. And the reason for that is that older females produce larvae with a bigger oil globule. And that's what the larvae use to sustain themselves for at least a few days while they're drifting out at sea. If you have a little oil globule and you're ready to eat and there's nothing to eat, you starve to death. You have a bigger oil globule, you have an extra couple of whatever days to get into some place that's got food. So you want to know how old the fish are. You want to have older, bigger fish in your population. And the way we age fish is by using their ear bones. Rockfish have ear bones. Most bony fishes, the croakers, the sculpins, and so forth, they all have ear bones. Rockfishes have large ones because there's kind of a corollary that fishes with larger ear bones either make sounds themselves, so they have to hear each other, or for some reason they are in an environment where hearing well is very important. And rockfishes do make sounds. It hasn't been studied very much at all, but they do make sounds. Boccaccio apparently make at least 3 different sounds. No one knows the different functions. Probably there's an agonistic kind of thing. Instead of fighting, you grunt at each other. Maybe a mating kind of thing, but they do make sounds. So they have large ear bones, and basically what you do is you count the, it's like a tree in essence, you count the rings on the ear bone, and you hope that they lay down a ring a year. It's pretty easy to count rings in fishes that live in environments where it's very cold in the summer, in the winter, and very warm in the winter, where you have, or in the summer, where you have a very different season. You have seasonality, because then the rings are really stark and beautiful, and you feel happy. But in Southern California, where there's not as much difference, you're not happy most of the time. I've aged, I don't know, 18 species of rockfish, and generally what you have to do is you have to take the ear bone and you break it, or you actually slice it, and then you have to burn it over a Bunsen, and then you have to polish it, and then you stick it under water. It's a long process. And it's fine when the rings are really big, when fish are young, but when a rockfish gets 60 or 80 or 90 years old, the increments, the little rings are microscopic because the fish hasn't grown all that much. By the way, fishes, virtually all of them, grow continually. So in 2000, when it's not here, the year-old ones were probably up in here someplace. So population is slowly starting to rebound. And in fact, this is what is thought to have happened to the Boccaccio population over time. This is of the adults. This is actually the biomass. The total poundage of adult Boccaccio in Southern California is thought to have just plummeted, I guess, through 99. But I will show you a more happy side. Anon. So, this is a whole series of rockfishes. And you notice the good news is that for most of them, they all took a header down to about 2,000, and they all are starting to come back. Okay? So basically, the deal is when a population is thought to be down to 20%, this is actually, the line has to go down to the 2. When it gets down to about 20% of its unfished population, the federal government declares it overfished. That is a specific legal definition. And when that happens, you have to have what's called a rebuilding program. And the rebuilding program usually involves somehow cutting down the fishery for the species. Now, it can be draconian, semi-draconian, it depends on the species. In the case of cowcods, which are this one, cowcods have really not come back all that much. What the federal government did was they took all the major offshore banks of Southern California, Tanner, Cortez, Osborne, all of those, and they basically said, ain't nobody fishing out there. End of story. You can't put a hook on the bottom because you might catch a cowcod. And if you do catch a cowcod on the coast here, I think at one time it was like 1 per boat, and like a party boat. And if you caught the one, you had to run away. You had to go someplace else. So it can be extremely draconian. Boccaccio were never quite that bad, but not good. And the fact that they all started going up at the same time, what actually that tells us is around 1999, there was a really good survivorship of young for many, many species. And so you're now starting to see a little bit of upticks for a number of species. And in fact, for other things like lingcods were declared overfished at about the same time, and they've actually come back because lingcod have eggs that they put on a nest, and the male comes over and sprays sperm on them, and the males guard them, and their population can increase much faster than rockfish are just open by what they do. So I'm going to go through some rockfishes, just give you an idea of what lives on the Pacific coast. Most of these species, at least occasionally, are found in the channel. I think all of them, at least occasionally, some not so often. But I'm going to start from basically shallowest water and then run outwards. This is a grass rockfish, which you can find in tide pools, particularly in Central California. I had a friend, Rich Lee, who caught a 6-pound one in a tide pool smaller than the stage, right off San Simeon. So you can get very, very big fish coming into very, very shallow water. The juveniles generally are found in tide pools when they get to be, 6 inches long or so. They tend to get into 10, 15, 20 feet of water. And by the time you get into 50 feet of water, they're not very common at all. They live on the bottom. They live separate lives, except I guess when they're mating. You don't find them in schools. You don't find them kind of aggregated up. Always sitting in a hole. These are one of the primary live fish targets in the live fish fisheries. The live fish fishery is huge in Southern and Central California. All of those fish are kept alive and shipped mainly to Asian restaurants or Asian markets as live product. And you want to use fishes that are tough. And grass rockfish are extremely tough and are the backbone of the fishery. A dead, I'm not sure if this is true right now, but it's probably pretty close to this. A dead grass rockfish is probably worth 50 cents a pound. A live one at one time was worth $12 a pound. So a huge difference. And it's the reason that, number one, a lot of people got into the live fish business, and it's the other reason that the inshore rockfishers have just been like hammered for like 15 or 20 years, because all of a sudden you have people who would never think of going into a kelp bed to catch a grass rockfish because you get 50 cents for it. All of a sudden they're getting $12 for it, and all of a sudden you got all these people in kayaks and people in rowboats.
Why the live?
Why live? It's a cultural thing. Asian folks really trust looking at a living fish and going like, I want that one, more than a fish on ice or more than a fish fillet that's sitting in a refrigerator. So they actually, that's the driver, is the Asian community. White people, eat them too, but the driver are the Asians. There's a tree fish. No one knows where that name came from. Usually you can kind of guess where a name comes from. Often there is an Italian, Sicilian, or occasionally Portuguese derivative. You go, okay, well, we kind of understand that. But treefish, it kind of appeared, the earliest record I can find for them is around 1880. And I read some report. They got a whole bunch of treefish. I'm like, well, did you just make that up, Jack? What's going on? So, tends to be found in, 10, 15, 20 feet down to maybe 120 feet of water, but most typically in 60, 80 feet of water, highly territorial. You almost never see more than one within a biting distance. They have these big red or orange lips, and that's used as warning. They will flare their mouths at each other. If they get really pissed at each other, they'll actually lock jaws. And then, I don't know, someone decides, someone wins, and someone loses. They often do not have these little spots. No one knows why. You see them sometimes with spots and without spots, or if the same fish can change and have spots and not. No one's ever looked at that. It's a nice shot. Dan Richards, National Park Service, took this picture. This is a kelp rockfish, which is often not found in kelp, but boy, when they are, pretty nice, huh? Man, they blend in real well. You tend to find them, again, solitary, but sometimes people report seeing 100, kind of in a loose aggregation. A lot of times they're up in the water column, kind of waving, often waving with the fronds. They have these big, lacy pectoral fins and big eye, kind of a fin across this nape body there. Lovely fish, and generally by the time you get to about 70, 80 feet of water, they kind of peter out. There's a couple of folks fighting each other, by golly. This is copper rockfish, and that's a quillback on the left. Both can be territorial. Quillbacks are often territorial. Coppers, you know, sometimes you see a whole bunch of coppers all together, and sometimes clearly they like each other. A little hard to know why. Could be habitat related. If they have really good high relief habitat, they may be more territorial than if it's low relief kind of cruddy stuff and everybody has to just do the best they can. This picture was actually taken off British Columbia, but the same phenomenon of locking jaws occurs here between a lot of these benthic bottom-oriented species.
The quillback have poisonous spines, Bill?
They all do. All rockfishes have venomous spines, but the amount of venom varies between species. There's actually only been one paper where they actually looked at the venom gland. The venom gland, like all scorpion fishes, and that's what these are, the venom gland is located right at the base of the spine. All of the dorsal spines could have a venom gland. There are 3 anal spines that could. There's 1 pelvic. The spines on the head, top of the head and the sides, they are not venomous. So there's only one paper where they looked at about 14 species of rockfishes, all the way from boccaccios to brown rockfish, all kinds. And they found it was kind of hit or miss, even on the same fish. There might be venom glands on some of these dorsals and not on the others. And so it's very hard to generalize. What we know for sure, however, is that the venom of a rockfish is nothing compared to like a stonefish. Stonefishes, which are tropical scorpion fishes, stonefishes, they estimated before an anti-venom had been created, there was a 50% mortality rate from stonefishes. Stonefishes are found throughout the Indo-Pacific. There's a classic story, J.L.B. Smith, the only racist ichthyologist. Well, they may all be racist, but he was the only person who put anything racist in a scientific paper about fish. He said, he wrote a paper in 1952 in Copeia, the ichthyology journal. He said he was collecting fish in Mozambique, which at the time was a Portuguese colony. And the first thing he said is the natives there are very good sailors because they have Arab blood in them, which means like there's a gene for sailing. That's basically what that is. So I remember reading that and going like, okay. So then he did, but the report was getting stung by a stonefish, and basically it collected a whole bunch of fish, put them in a tray, and then he reached up and grabbed one without looking, which is like a stupid thing to do. And a 4-inch long stonefish, one spine got him in the thumb. And he said that within 30 seconds, this this just broadcast of pain ratcheted up his arm, up to his shoulder, and he found himself writhing uncontrollably in pain on the beach. Right? So he has no memory of how he did this, but he winds up at a lighthouse, and the lighthouse keeper injected him with Novocaine, and he said that had no effect on the pain at all. That's kind of depressing. And then the lighthouse keeper injected him with morphine. Well, you know, morphine's great, man. You get your leg blown off and numb, and you get injected with morphine. Well, you're kind of depressed, but at least it doesn't hurt. So that had no effect on the pain at all. So that's not good. So then a local person came in, chewing some green stuff and spit it on his thumb. And that had no effect on the pain at all. So that's really not good. So then his wife comes in and she has a bucket of hot water and she sticks his thumb in it and the pain subsides. To the point where it's bearable. It hurts, but it's bearable. So he goes, oh, that was great. He takes it out and bam! Sticks it back. So that is the treatment of choice for venomous wounds, is hot water. And basically, if you think about it, the venom is a rather complicated molecule. If you heat it, it's not like you bust it apart, but you alter its shape. And your body no longer goes, oh, this is horrible. You go, oh, just another form of protein. So people get stung by round rays in Belmont, the lifeguard sticks their foot in hot water, and that's really the treatment of choice. I used to work on California scorpion fishing, another life, and we would drag up 100, 200 of them on a boat, put them in a big aquarium on the boat, and pull them out one by one and jab a tag in them. The tag would have my name, my phone number, and so forth. And you're holding this scorpion fish, which has people haven't died from California scorpion fish wounds, but it hurts a lot. You're holding with one hand, you're jabbing with the other, things flailing around, and we would always have a pan of hot water right next to us. And as soon as you get jabbed, you stick your hand in it, and it never hurt any worse than being hit by a needle or something like that. So it does work. It's actually very, very effective. I always thought Boccaccio hurt the most, by the way. When I was a deckhand on a party boat, I got stung by everything. And I always thought Boccaccio hurt the most. They also smell different than any other rockfish. I smell a bag full of Boccaccio as opposed to any other rockfish. And they have this kind of sicky sweet smell. And I remember part of my PhD dissertation work was to go on aboard party boats out of Santa Barbara. I would go out every week, a day a week for 3 years, and I measured and counted every single fish that was brought on board. I was interested in the image, Boccaccio against everything else. It was really, really interesting. That was my first experience with worrying about the scientific method, as I remember. I remember Tony, Frank Hampton, and his brother Tony ran the boat for sea landing. And Frank, it was his first day, and Tony, it was his first day, and they were scamps. They were scamps. And but I was the only constant person. I was there every week. So I was on the boat, and I'm sitting in the wheelhouse, and then it's 6:30 in the morning, and they're leaving the harbor, and Tony, the deckhand, is sitting next to me on a kind of a sofa there, and he hands me a jewel, is what he hands me. And I'm sitting there, 1967, long ago, no one can arrest me, unless I was in Texas, in which case, life imprisonment. So I'm sitting there, I'm going like, well, I wonder if I can measure fish at the end of the trip if I'm ripped out of my mind. And it turns out you can. But the passengers kind of wonder what's so funny. This is a great painting. This is in my new book. The book is out in 2 months. I saw this as I think it's actually a postcard. I saw it in Juneau about a year ago, and it's done by an Alaskan artist. It's a still life. I think it's called still life with copper rockfish. And I mean, it's really, as a still life, it's phenomenal. I mean, Jesus. And it's got a copper rockfish there. I said, how much do you, I called the dude up and I said, can I use this image in the book? He said, yeah. I said, how much do you want for that image? He said, 4K. I said, I don't think so. Because the Rockfish book, I have a history of this. The Rockfish book, the cover, which you cannot see, I don't know why I did that, is done by Ray Troll, the Alaskan artist. And I paid him 2K to paint it. And then he sent me a photograph of it, and I said, how much do you want for the painting? Which is huge. It's like this big. And he said, a couple thousand more. And I said, yeah, I'll do it, right? So I'm going like, well, maybe I can get this. But he's going to have to come down. Waiting. It's not very big either. So this is a, well, you know, you could put anything against stylaster, against this hydrocoral, and look phenomenal, right? So here's a gopher rockfish. Right there. Again, gophers, classic benthic species, heavy-bodied, lots of spines. That tells you, you look at a rockfish, you can almost certainly tell what they do by their shape. The fishes that tend to just sit either on rocks or in crevices or even on the mud tend to be deep-bodied, not streamlined, big spines all over the place. The ones that live up off the water, the ones that are called epibenthic, they're kind of often school, sometimes way up in the water column. Olive rockfish, blues, and so forth, tend to be streamlined, almost no head spines at all. Very typical. This is kind of a nice, classic benthic species. This is a quillback, another quillback shot. This is another Kuika chetran shot. Not very common here. You see occasionally you'll see one at San Miguel, but really a more northern form. Kind of the classic, before there was a lot of fishing, this is what you would see at San Miguel or Central California. These are all blue rockfish, probably the blue blotched rockfish. Very, very good classic midwater species. They feed primarily in the water column on salps and other jellyfish, on little juvenile rockfishes in a good year, things like that. Copepods, other large zooplankton. Related to them, fairly closely related, is the black rockfish. Very rare in the channel, but once you start turning the corner into Central California, more common. And by the time you get to Oregon and Washington, one of the most abundant fishes. And they kind of do what olive rockfish and blues do here, kind of up in the water column in large, sometimes very large schools, and feeding primarily on midwater creatures that come through. Also closely related to the other two, this is the olive rockfish. I did my PhD dissertation on the life history of these. Most common from about Monterey to about the Channel Islands. Kind of a limited range of abundance anyway. And closely related to them, so closely that sometimes when they're in the sub and one passes by, we go, I don't know. This is a yellowtail rockfish, which if you have them dead and they're sitting next to each other, they're obviously different. But when they kind of rush by you, by the port, you go, I'm not sure. The biggest tip-off is that every scale will have a little fleck of orange-brown color, which is very obvious when you have a nice still like this, but it's not so obvious when the fish is 20 feet away and all you can see is its tail going away. Because in spite of the name, yellowtail rockfish do not always have underwater yellow tails. Getting into somewhat deeper water, this is the widow rockfish, big commercial species. Huge commercial species for about 3 years. And that's how long it took to decimate these huge schools that occurred from Northern California to Washington. This fish was protected from commercial fishing mainly because it eats primarily salps and other gelatinous zooplankton. And so people who, commercial fishermen who used hook and line, just didn't catch them very often. And people who drug nets on the bottom couldn't catch them because they live over rocks. So it wasn't until about 1978, 1979 that someone figured out you could drag a midwater trawl over a rock pile, way up off the bottom, and you could get hundreds of tons of widows. And they actually termed it the Great Widow Roundup or something like that. There was about 3 years that it took to just nail the population. It didn't drive it to extinction, but it really put a crimp in the population. Kind of down in the bottom, this is a brown rockfish. Browns, this is actually, I figured out recently, an aquarium shot. This is an atypical place for them to live. Where a brown likes to live is in this harbor. It likes to live on the riprap with mud, kind of sitting in the mud, but right next to a rock. That's what it likes. And it doesn't like clear water, kind of turbid water, maybe in 20, 30 feet of water. That's what it likes. An astronomically good shot. Not only do you have our favorite hydrocoral, but you have the China rockfish, very, very classic, deep-bodied, bottom-dwelling species. China's, you occasionally see them at San Miguel. Water's cold there. And then the further north you go, the more abundant they are. This is a juvenile yellow eye rockfish. Yellow eyes are found in Southern California. And interestingly, it was at one time thought that they stopped. Right at San Diego, at one time was thought to be as far south as they got, the water got too warm. But if you go off Baja California, particularly the area around Punta Baja, Bahia San Quintin, the water's actually colder there than it is in Southern California. It's actually the temperature of Monterey. And that's because you get a lot of upwelling. The winds blow in just the right way to bring deep water into the near shore. And you'll get 10, 11 degrees centigrade, 8 degrees centigrade, 50 degree water there when it's 70 degrees in Southern California. And so there are some cold water species that kind of skip Southern California. You'll find them off Baja, you'll find it from Monterey North, and this species is one of them that seems to have a disjunct population. This at one time was thought to be two species. This is what the juvenile looks like. Very, very striking fish with those big stripes. And that's what the adult looks like. So until people started catching the intermediate ones, where there's still like a faint stripe, everyone thought, well, the little one is one species and the big one is another. This is one of the larger of the rockfishes. They get up to the 20-pound range, 25-pound range, and live at least 160 years.
Wow.
For yellow eyes. Very typical, and they're one of the only species that actually has a yellow eye, thank goodness for all of us. This shot was taken at a very unusual place south of Ketchikan, south of Sitka. On the outer coast along the panhandle, there is a little seamount, small thing, that comes up, and at the top of it are astronomical numbers of lingcod. This picture was actually shot there. And you don't even get a sense of it. Literally, one lingcod after another, big lingcods after another. On the top of this ridge, I have a photograph where there's lingcods sitting on top of lingcods, actually like cordwood. Just incredible. And what they seem to be doing is, you can watch them do this, there are currents that sweep up this feature and they carry small rockfish up it. And the rockfish will get to the level of the top, and a lingcod will go and grab it and then pull itself back and plunk itself right down again. It looks like some pipe organ or something, and you're pushing buttons. Very striking. There are a number still of very abundant rockfishes in Southern California. This is one of them. This is the square spot rockfish. There's a whole group of rockfishes that are very closely related to each other. They all live on the bottom, and they all have these white blotches on the back. Subgenus Cedastomus. This is the starry rockfish, really a handsome-looking fish. And that's closely related. The rosy rockfish. These are both hyper-abundant in Southern California. One of the reasons is they don't get very big, so people don't eat them anymore. Well, people eat them. Larger fish don't eat them. Closely related. See, they all kind of look the same. This is the sword spine rockfish, which is really closely related genetically.
Yeah, how long are those?
Oh, about 9 inches long, something like that. This is another of the dwarf species that you find sometimes in the hundreds of thousands. This is the pygmy rockfish, Sebastes wilsoni. And again, I'm sure they were not as abundant 50 years ago as they are today. No one has ever done any research on them because they're so small, even when you use little sabiki bait catcher hooks, like number 10s and like 8-pound test, and you still don't catch them. I think we've caught in all the time, in like 15 years, we've caught 2 of them. Even though we know that they're down below the boat, because we take the sub down and we go, look at all the pygmy rockfish. People fishing on the boat with little tiny hooks still cannot catch them. So people haven't done much work on that species. This is the kind of dominant species in terms of biomass, like pounds of fish. This is Sebastes jordani. Sebastes jordani, the short belly rockfish. These are juveniles. The juveniles in a good year, where a lot of them survive, you'll find literally millions of them in nearshore waters. I think this is on the Yukon, the ship that was sunk off Mission Beach intentionally as a place for divers to go. And about 2 years ago, there was a huge recruitment of these animals. I'm sorry?
What are these?
These are short belly rockfish. Sebastes jordani, and they're called short bellies because their anus isn't where other fish's ani are. So a typical fish's anus, and this is the kind of thing you guys talk about at dinner, right? You're like, so where is the fish's anus? So a typical anus is right next to the anal fin, hence the name, anal fin. Hey! But in the short belly, it's way up here. It's about halfway between the anal fin and the where the gill is. It's right there. So the belly is short. So the belly. This is one of the only fishes on the Pacific coast that no one can make a commercial fishery out of. People keep going like, there's so many of them, but they only get, like a really big one is a foot long, and there aren't that many that are that big. So thank God for the fact that no one has ever commercially fished them, because these are incredibly important for seabirds. Seabirds feed their young on short-bellied rockfish. Particularly like at the Farallones, you get not on the adults, but on the juveniles. The juvenile short bellies are up in 30, 40, 50 feet of water below the surface, and you get alcids, all these fishes that are all these birds that are nesting on the Farallones or San Miguel. And if there's no short bellies that year, no baby short bellies, birds starve. I mean, the fish will find goddamn, I never think of birds, so I keep saying the fish. The birds will find alternative food, but it's usually not sufficient to keep the full population of young birds alive. So in years where there's a lot of these things, everybody's happy except short belly. And we don't know how. This is the flag rockfish. Flags are probably just about the most striking fish we see, usually in 200, 300, 400 feet of water. They are very sedentary. The little ones, the ones that are 2 inches long, you find them below drifting kelp mats. Not exclusively, but most often. And then when they get some size, they go down and settle out. Why are they this color, which seems very striking? I mean, it's like a big striking color. Well, if you actually turn the lights off of the sub, there's ambient light. There's actually a fair amount of light. You can see the fish. But at that depth, anything that's red appears black. In fact, when you get below 60 feet of water, anything that's red looks black, because there is no red light down there to reflect off. And so what you're actually looking at is a kind of zebra effect, where the outline is all broken up. So clearly this is a way of kind of camouflaging themselves, either to predators or to prey. For a long time there was thought to be only flag rockfish, but because these are rockfish, there's this thing. This is Sebastes babcocki, which is the red-banded rockfish. And for a long time people said, oh, it's the same thing. They got these vertical red and white bars. But if you actually look at this bar here, I think, it's placed differently in flags than it is in red-bandeds. There's some differences in other things, but clearly very closely related to each other. You go out onto the sand, there are not as many species of rockfish, but there are still some. This is the half-banded rockfish, which you find, this is a nice habitat for them. Kind of coarse, they don't like mud, but they like kind of coarse sand. The juveniles, you got to Anacapa, and on this side of Anacapa, it's very striking. When you go out to about 120 feet of water, 140 feet, there's a lot of rock on this side in that depth. Kind of peters out in about 250, but there's a lot of rock. And the juveniles of half-bandeds, you see swarms of them, you know, like this, about this big, sometimes 40 or 50 feet off the bottom, and then all the way down. This one, that's a nice typical bottom coloration. They get all blotchy and so forth. There's a very urban Cuskey. It's just going like whatever. You know, it's like clearly it just doesn't care. And a half-banded that is unaware of the lodger. You get into deeper water, these are boccaccio. The overfish, officially overfished species, used to be the #1 commercially fished rockfish in Southern California and Central California. Used to be boccaccio. This is what you see on a very good year around an oil platform. This is platform Gilda in 2002. Very good survivorship of young. We estimated there were, how many? 40,000 of them around this platform. And they don't stay very long. They stay about 6 months. And then they go into deeper water, as do many species of rockfish.
That variation in color is common?
This one, that's a different species. That's a vermilion. Sorry about that. There's another one there, down in there. These central ones are boccaccios.
How big do they get?
Oh, they get to 3 feet long and 20-something pounds. I just got a photograph. A Alaska Fish and Game biologist, port sampler, sent me one, and she had a tape measure of it, and it was 102 centimeters, so that's more than 3 feet long, and I can't remember, 28 pounds.
I have a question. What's the survivability of those after you put them back in the water? There's a limitation on how many you can keep. And
Right.
So we get that question all the time from fishermen out there. It's like, well, why should I throw it back? It's going to die.
Yeah, it turns out that's not the case. Fortunately for the rockfish, unfortunately for the fishermen. Chris Lowe, who's a professor at Long Beach State, had got a bunch of money and had a bunch of grad students answer that question. They went out to platforms where you can predictably catch rockfish. They caught rockfish and they stuck an acoustic tag in them. They actually opened them up and inserted the tag and sewed them up, and then they released them. And then they had a recording device, an acoustic device attached to the platform, and which just went continually. And they found that many more rockfish survived than I would have thought, because rockfish look horrid and often. You know, the eyes bulge out, and their stomach everts from their mouths, and you go like, how can this fish survive? But it turns out the survivorship was remarkably good for many species. It improved when you release them at depth, and what they would do is they would take a milk carton, and they basically put the fish in the water, take the milk carton and put it over the fish, so now you have the bottom of the milk carton up, and they had a lead weight on the top so that it went down this way, so it drove the fish all the way down the bottom, and then they would pull on the milk carton and the fish would swim away, and so it was at depth. And that was more effective than just releasing them, but even releasing them was pretty good. So I'm not saying if you got a fish from 900 feet it would survive, but they were pulling fish out of 200, 300 feet, and survivorship for weeks afterwards. It's not like, you know, they got pings for a day and then you don't know what happened. Yeah, it was remarkably good. There's a picture of an adult boccaccio. I took the picture, it's just a really pretty picture. Just thought I'd throw it in. These are adults at Platform Gale. Platform Gale has the highest densities of 2 overfished rockfishes of any place in Southern California, platform or natural reef. It has very high densities of boccaccio and fair numbers of cowcods. Cowcods are down to like 4% of their unfished levels. Boccaccio, or I can't remember now, like 15%. And there's nothing magical about platforms. I mean, they weren't sprinkled with fairy dust or anything, but they are habitat. And for many of these species of fish, particularly rockfishes, they don't care what the habitat is. They don't care what it's made of. If it's in the right depth and has places to hide, and you can see this is a cross beam at the bottom of the platform. Here's the shell mound, which is the seafloor. You have this long, empty area, which kind of serves like a big cave. And many species of rockfish, that's all they care about. As long as the cave is there, they're happy. So, and there's relatively little fishing around platforms. There's some people who work on the platforms, fish to a certain extent. Some boats pull up, but since 9/11, people freak out. If you're on a platform and you see some little boat come up next to you, you don't know, it could be Osama. Well, it's not Osama anymore. It could be Osama's son, who is demanding proof that his dad is dead. So I'm going like, show him the picture. So there's relatively little. In fact, I actually asked the guy who worked on gales. I said, how much fishing do you guys do? And he said, well, for the first week or two, when you work on a platform and you get off shift, you fish. He said, after a while, though, you get kind of tired of that, and you get off work, and all you want is a dove bar. And I said, oh. He said, yeah, now that Veneco has bought Platform Gale, we don't get any dove bars. I'm going like, okay. And I don't like the apples either. We used to get galas. Now we get Red Delicious. And I think to myself like, what's my role here? Is this kind of a kumbaya labor kind of thing? Does he want to sing Joe Hill? Does he want to sing I can sing those songs. I don't know if I want to link arms with the guy exactly, but I can. And then he gone on to something else. But anyway, fishing pressure tends to be less. Yes.
It looks like a road. What is that?
A road. Oh, that. Oh, you're looking sideways at the platform is going up vertically.
Oh, okay.
So you're looking sideways at this crossbeam. The crossbeam's about 5 feet from here to the bottom. So you're going along it. And it's a round object, but you can't tell that because you're kind of looking at it flat. So you find that these platforms, the way they were created, they weren't built at sea. They were built in like Korea on land and then towed across the Pacific and then dropped vertically and then dropped, I don't even know how they do this, and then dropped down. And so they tend to have lots of markings on them, writing on them, all kinds of things. That looks like a boccaccio, but because these are rockfish, it's not a boccaccio. This is the silver gray rockfish, which is not found down here, but it's found up north, and it's kind of the analog to boccaccio. You would think, oh my gosh, it must be really closely related to boccaccio. It turns out that nothing is closely related to boccaccio. That there are no living species of rockfish which are closely related. And if you look at kind of the clocks that have been set up, how fast do mutations occur in DNA, based on certain assumptions, it's thought that nothing's been related to boccaccio closely for about 6 million years. The closest relative died out. And the very closest thing to them are short-belly rockfish. But again, it's a very, if you look at the kind of the tree that have been created, it's not closely related at all, but it's the closest we have. This is a cowcod, my favorite rockfish. Another one that's been around apparently an extremely long time. There's nothing closely related to it whatsoever. They get up to about 28 pounds, again about 3 feet long. I saw the world record at the bottom of the platform Eureka in 740 feet of water off Long Beach. It far surpassed the largest one ever caught. I mean, it looked like the Goodyear blimp when I was there. Remarkable. They produce, a big female produces about 3 million eggs a season. And if you think about it, these things live maybe 70 years, and mature when they're about 7 or 8 years old. So you have like 60 years of cranking endless numbers of larvae out. Your success rate must be horrid if you have to do that. This is a pelagic juvenile cowcod. Isn't that remarkable, the difference? No one has ever photographed a pelagic juvenile before in the wild until this guy, I can't remember his name, Todd Winter? I can't remember his name. But he sent it to me about 6 months ago. He wanted to know what it was, and fortunately, Mary Nishimoto, my associate, who's an expert on pelagic juveniles, she knew what it was. And I'm going like, I gotta put that on the back of my new book. So I had about 8 or 10 potential photographs for the back of the book. And I made the mistake of showing them all to my wife, to Jane. And it's a mistake because she's just too honest, right? And she goes like, she looks at it, she goes, is that a lizard? And I'm going like, well, that's no good. That's bad. If the average person, Jane, thinks it's a lizard, so it's in the book, but not on the back. It's not a lizard. This is a couple other species of rockfish. I always think about it like a boy and his dog. You know, this is platform gale, the deep one off Anacapa that's got all the cowcods and bocaccio. And this is one of the vertical pieces of the jacket, so it's like a piling in essence. Again, in 704 feet, right at the bottom. This is a Mexican rockfish named because it almost never gets into Southern California. It's much more common when you get down off the Baja California coast. Does Mexico amuse you, my dear?
Just a comment.
Wow. No, perhaps you could share with the rest of the class. So, out to the principal. And then this is a green blotched rockfish. At these depths, in particular, big fish tend to ignore each other. If you're too large to eat, they don't fight. They just kind of hang out and ignore each other. So you see a lot of this kind of behavior.
What interests both of them?
What interests them?
Both of
Proust.
them, right.
Proust primarily. I find that some of them will go for Dickens and Keats. A few of them, more effeminate ones, tend to like Keats. I'm sorry. That was just, I don't know where I went. What?
Well, what are they both?
Why are they both there?
No, what are they eating?
Oh, what are they eating? At this place, interestingly, there's a lot of euphausids down there. Almost every time we go, swarms of krill. And I think a lot of the fish there are eating krill, small fishes. We've seen little hake, ones that are like 4 or 5 inches long, schools of hake. There are spot prawns around the base of the platform. So like with most rockfishes, particularly deep ones, they'll eat anything they can get. They're not specialized. Very few rockfish species specialize in one group of fish or one group of prey or another. They do like Proust, though. Remember that scene of that trawl that had all those bright red fish sticking out of the mesh, Pacific Ocean perch? This is what they actually look like in life. When they die, they turn bright red, but this is a very typical pattern and color. Now we're down around 900 feet, 1,000 feet of water. These are the deepest, most of the commonly seen rockfishes. This is a shot off the Aleutian Islands. This, for a long time, was thought to be one species, but of course now we know it's actually 2 species. This is the black-spotted rockfish, which has almost no black spots in it. See, there's a few little black. This one is so closely related to the rough-eye rockfish that even if you have them in your lab and you're staring at them and measuring things, sometimes you cannot tell the species apart, even though genetically they are different. They can tell each other apart, but we cannot tell them apart. And I routinely send these photographs from the Gulf of Alaska to Jay Orr, who is the guy who described this species. He's the guy who can tell them apart. And about 80% of the time he goes, I don't know what it is. So we still have a lot of work to do. This is a Diploploa, the split-nosed rockfish, very common in the channel here, and this is a very typical habitat. Not mud exactly, but kind of soft or coarse, sandy bottoms. Habitats, this is a bank rockfish. This is a sponge. You find that a lot of rockfishes tend to take advantage of whatever complexity there is on the bottom. In this case, this is a sponge garden off of the footprint outside of Anacapa, but you find them in corals and all kinds of things. That's what a bank looks like when it's out of its crevice. And I think there's only two more. This is Aurora rockfish. Now we're down around 1,300 feet of water. Rockfish kind of poop out around 2,000 feet of water. There's virtually none of them, and by about 1,500 feet they're not abundant, except for this little species here, the Aurora, and this one here, the black eel. This is down around 1,800 feet of water on a feature outside the footprint called the Piggy Bank. We just named it that, by the way. You always wonder how things get their names. It was an unnamed bank, and people in my lab were sitting around going, what are we going to call this? And someone said, how about a piggy bank? And we went, yay! And so if you use it enough times, everybody calls it that. It's really interesting. We use it in papers and talks, piggy bank. So there's the rockfishes. I want to show you, that's what the new book is going to look like. Certainly, what you want to know about this, it goes a postmodern experience with this absolutely astounding painting by Thomas Wars, who was a painter in San Francisco, and he did this. I think he was about 21 years old at the time, and about 1880. What I like about it, first of all, it's got a lot of Pacific Coast fish. You can actually identify many of these species. There's a yellow eye rockfish right there. But the other thing I like is, in a time when there was virulent anti-Chinese feeling, this is a very sympathetic painting, and I really liked it. So the Smithsonian has it for $100. They let you use it for the cover. That's the cover. Questions? Yes.
You referred to a fish that's found at 900 feet as the most commonly seen. You're the only one that gets to 900 feet. Who commonly gets down there?
That's actually very true. I should say that a few of us who go down there commonly see that. That's right. No, it's...
You're not going to see it.
No, you're not going to see it because you're a loser. So. But it's kind of refreshing to find someone who just admits it. Sits there and takes my abuse.
I don't want
No, I know you don't want to. No, I don't want to go either. None of us want to. I know. Oh, you should be afraid. It's so much fun. It's so cool. Oh my God. It really is. It's the high point of my years going to this little two-person sub. The one we used for 14 years was the size of a telephone booth. The new one that's made by the Canadians, by Newco, is called a deep worker, and it's actually two very small submarines. The size, each one is smaller than a smart car, that have been fused together. So the pilot sits in one sub, and you sit in the other. And what's freaky is that there's no connection between the two of you. There's no like, you can't go, hey Jeff, how's it going? You have complete control over your life support system. So there's this long checklist where you have to make sure the CO2 level is right and the scrubbers are working. And I'm dyslexic. I am dyslexic. And halfway through the dive, Jeff goes, okay, it looks like we're going to have to increase the amount of oxygen. And I go, okay, it's this way. And he goes, no, you're going to die if you do that. Okay, I guess it's the other way. I hate that part. But every other part, it's so cool. It's really cool. Yeah.
Ones that live on, or rest on the bottom, do they feed right on the bottom, or do they come up?
You know, most of them, that's a good question. Most of them feed on things that are slightly off the bottom. They're little epibenthic things. So there are very few rockfish, there may be no rockfish, that literally never come off the bottom at all. You do find fishes like gopher rockfish, black and yellows. And look what they eat. They eat crabs and shrimp primarily. So they are feeding on benthic organisms. But in deep water, I have a feeling there's not enough to eat to be specialized. So you eat whatever comes around that you can get your mouth full. Once you get into fishes that live in 400, 500, 600 feet of water. Anything else? Yes.
Since California current moving southward,
Yes.
are they going on tidal currents or eddies when they're juveniles and otherwise
Oh,
they're gonna leave
well,
their band of temperature?
Well, actually, in our area, what happens is the California current comes down Central California, sweeps around San Miguel, and then you get a counter current that comes back up around Anacapa and then down to Santa Monica almost, and then you get a current that's actually coming up the coast in Santa Barbara, the channel. And in fact, during sometimes of the year, you have this big eddy that goes around and around and around. It actually carries organisms around and around several times.